The cage hung from a rusted iron chain in the village square of Ashford Hollow, swaying slightly whenever the autumn wind gusted down from the northern pass. It had once held a bear, years ago, back when traveling menagerie shows still passed through these parts. Nobody had used it since. The bars had gone orange with rust, and the lock was so old it took the blacksmith himself to force it open when the village constable finally hauled a new prisoner up the square and demanded it be sealed shut again. Inside it now was the orc girl. She couldn't have been more than 15 winters old, though it was hard to tell with orckin. They grew differently than humans, faster in some ways, slower in others. Her tusks were small, still pushing up through her lower jaw, not yet the great curved things that marked a grown warrior. Her skin was a mottled green-gray, like lichen on old stone, and beneath it her ribs showed clearly through skin gone tight with hunger. One eye was swollen shut, the lid purple-black encrusted. The other watched everything with the flat, exhausted wariness of a creature that had stopped expecting anything from the world except more of the same. Tomas Greer, the village blacksmith, first saw her on a Tuesday, hauling a delivery of nails to the chandler's stall 3 doors down from the square. He hadn't meant to stop walking. His feet simply did it without consulting him, the way a man's feet sometimes will when something in front of him doesn't fit the shape the world is supposed to have. "Don't get close," warned old Henrik, the cobbler, from his stoop. "Bites." Patrol had to knock it senseless twice just to get the chain on it. "She's a child," Tomas said. "She's an orc," Henrik said, as if that settled the matter. In Ashford Hollow, for most people it did. Tomas didn't argue. He simply stood there a long moment, watching the way the girl's good eye tracked him, not with hatred, not with the snarling menace the village expected from her kind, but with something far more unsettling: simple calculation. Is this one dangerous? Is this one going to hurt me too? How much will it hurt, and how long until it's over? He'd seen that look before. Years ago, in the border wars, on the faces of men who'd been broken by captivity and had learned to measure every new face by the same brutal arithmetic. He'd hoped never to see it on anyone again, let alone a child. He went home that evening and didn't sleep well. The next morning, he returned to the square with a sack of barley bread under one arm, an old kindness he hadn't planned and didn't fully understand in himself. The girl was still in the cage. Someone, children, probably, egged on by parents who should have known better, had thrown stones in the night. A fresh cut crossed her cheekbone, dried now, dark against gray-green skin. He crouched outside the bars, far enough that she wouldn't feel cornered, and set the bread down within her reach. She didn't move for a long time, just watched him with that same flat, weighing stare. Then, slowly, as if expecting the bread to be a trick, yanked away the moment she reached for it. She crept forward and took it. She didn't eat in front of him. She retreated to the far corner of the cage first, turning her back, and only then did he hear the small, desperate sounds of someone eating like they hadn't eaten in days. He came back the next day, and the day after that. By the third day, Barin the tanner had noticed. "Why do you keep feeding it?" Barin asked, finding Tomas at the edge of the square that evening, arms crossed, his face set in the particular expression of a man preparing to be disapproving on principle. Tomas said. He hadn't meant to correct him. It simply came out, the way truth sometimes does before you've decided to speak it. Barin spat into the dirt. "It's a war orc whelp. Patrol found her in a nest 3 valleys over, past Crow's Ridge. Should have put a sword through her right there instead of dragging her all the way back here to feed and house at the village's expense. Magistrates planning to make an example of her before the autumn fair. Folk'll pay good coin to watch a beast hang, and Ashford Hollow could use the coin. What with the harvest coming in thin this year?" Tomas felt something cold settle into his stomach. "She's a child, Barin. She's an orc child. Won't stay a child long. You know what they grow into." Barin's voice dropped, conspiratorial, as if sharing some unpleasant secret. "My brother fought in the same border campaigns you did. Lost his arm to one of them. You telling me you don't remember what they're like?" Tomas remembered. He remembered burned villages and salted fields, and the particular screaming that came from places orc raiding parties had passed through. He also remembered, with equal clarity, the refugee columns of orckin fleeing the very same wars, families, elders, children, fleeing other orcs as much as fleeing humans, caught between 2 armies that both wanted them dead for different reasons. War didn't make villains of a whole people. War made villains of war, and everyone unlucky enough to be standing in it. He didn't say any of this to Birin. There wasn't a version of the argument that would land, not with a man who'd already decided what he believed before the conversation started. He simply said, "Good night, Birin," and went home. That night, he sat in his forge long after the fire had burned down to embers, turning a half-finished horseshoe over and over in his hands without really seeing it. He thought of his wife, gone 6 years now, taken by a winter fever that the village healer hadn't been able to break. He thought of his daughter, Ren, who hadn't lived past her 6th name day. Also fever, also winter, the two losses separated by less than 2 years, close enough that some nights he could barely remember which grief belonged to which face. He thought about empty rooms, about a forge that rang loud with hammer strikes all day and went terribly silent every evening, with no one to share supper with, no one to ask about his day, no one whose voice filled the quiet the way Ren's had once filled it with endless questions about why fire was orange and why iron got soft when it got hot, and whether the moon was a coin someone had dropped in the sky. He thought about the orc girl's one good eye, watching him not with malice but with simple, exhausted vigilance, waiting to discover what kind of cruelty he represented. He made his decision before the embers went fully dark. Ashford Hollow ran on old border law, the kind written generations back when the village sat close enough to contested territory that practical arrangements mattered more than tidy sentiment. Among its statutes was the ward claim. Any creature, human or otherwise, could be claimed from punishment by a villager willing to stand as guarantor for its future conduct. But the law wasn't generous. It was old and hard and exact, built by people who understood that mercy without consequence was simply an invitation to chaos. The magistrate, a narrow, ink-stained man named Corvini Aldrich, read the statute aloud to Tomas in his cramped office above the grain hall, his expression somewhere between disbelief and disdain. "You understand what you're proposing?" Aldrich said. It wasn't really a question. "The ward claim isn't a formality, Master Greer. You're not simply adopting a stray dog. If this creature ever harms another soul in this village, kills, maims, steals, even threatens, the punishment falls on you. Both punishments, in fact. Yours, and whatever was due to her besides. The old law doesn't believe in halfway mercy. I understand the terms. Do you? You don't know this creature. You don't know what violence might be sitting coiled inside her, waiting. Orc kin are bred for war the way hounds are bred for the hunt. It's in the marrow, whatever gentleness you think you're seeing now." Tomas thought of the way she'd turned her back to eat, ashamed even of her own hunger. He thought of how she'd flinched, violently, the one time he'd raised his hand too quickly near her, not to strike her, only to scratch an itch at his collar, and how she'd pressed herself into the corner of the cage afterward, breathing hard, waiting for a blow that never came. "I'll take the risk," he said. Aldrich studied him for a long moment, then shrugged, as if washing his hands of whatever foolishness was about to unfold. "Your funeral, Master Greer. Quite possibly literally." He reached for the ward papers, dipped his quill, and began the binding language in his small, precise hand. The blood price was taken that same hour, in the old way, not symbolic, never symbolic in Ashford Hollow, where the founders had distrusted symbols and built their laws instead around things that couldn't be argued with later. Tomas knelt at the worn village stone in the center of the square, the same stone where marriages were sealed and debts were settled, while Aldrich's clerk drew a thin blade across his forearm. The cut was shallow but precise, practiced. The clerk had clearly done this before, and Tomas watched his own blood well up and fall, drop by drop, into the binding bowl, mixing with the chalky white binding salt until the law was sealed in a way the old magic of the village would recognize and hold to. It hurt less than he expected. It always does, paying for something you've already decided is worth it. A small crowd had gathered to watch. Not many, but enough. Birin among them, arms crossed, jaw tight with disapproval, he didn't bother hiding. Old Henrik. A handful of others, drawn by the particular gravity that surrounds a man doing something foolish in public. When the binding was sealed, Aldrich's guards unlocked the cage. The orc girl didn't move at first. She stared at the open door the way a man dying of thirst might stare at water he suspected was poisoned, with a longing so deep it had curdled into suspicion. Reaching for it might cost her the last thing she had left, which was simply enduring whatever came next without being broken further by hope. Tomas crouched down outside the bars, low and unthreatening, the way you'd approach a spooked horse. "Nobody's going to hurt you again," he said, quiet enough that only she could hear it over the murmur of the watching crowd. "Not while you're under my roof. That's a promise, and I just paid blood to make it one the law has to honor." She studied him with her one good eye for a long, long moment, searching his face for the lie she clearly expected to find there. She didn't find it. Slowly, joint by joint like something unused to moving without pain, she crawled out of the cage. The crowd murmured. Someone, a child, from the sound of it, made a low hissing noise of disgust. Tomas ignored all of it. He simply stood, offered the girl nothing more than the space to walk beside him rather than behind him like a captive, and led her home through the narrow streets of Ashford Hollow toward the forge. He named her Soraya, a word his grandmother used to murmur over the hearth fire on cold nights, back when Tomas himself was a boy small enough to sit in her lap. It meant, roughly, the one who comes through fire. He didn't tell Soraya the meaning at first. He simply offered the name, the way you'd offer a hand, and waited to see if she'd take it. She didn't speak for the better part of a month. She slept in the corner of the forge nearest the door, as far from him as the small space allowed, curled tight, always facing outward, always alert, even in sleep. She flinched at sudden movements. The clang of hammer on anvil made her go rigid the first dozen times, though she gradually learned to read the rhythm of his work and stopped expecting each strike to be aimed at her. She ate alone, in silence, watching him from across the room the way a wild animal watches the door of a trap it's wandered into, uncertain whether it's been caught or simply, temporarily, fed. Tomas didn't push. He'd learned patience the hard way, in the years after Ren died, when grief had taught him that some wounds couldn't be rushed toward healing no matter how badly you wanted them closed. He simply kept doing what he did, working the forge, eating his meals, leaving food within her reach without comment, and going about the business of being unremarkable and unthreatening, day after day, until unremarkable and unthreatening became, slowly, something she could trust. The village did not extend the same patience. Children threw stones when she walked to the well for water, though they learned quickly to do it from a distance and run, since Soraya's reflexes, even starved, even injured, were faster than any human child's. Old women spat on their doorsteps when she passed, muttering old village curses against ill luck and beastkin. Berin refused outright to sell Tomas leather for harness work for as long as the creature lived under his roof, which meant Tomas began making 4-day round trips to the next town over just to trade for supplies, telling no one why, letting the village assume what it wanted. It cost him. Customers who'd brought him their plowshares and horseshoes for 15 years began quietly taking their business to the smith 2 villages over, despite the extra day's travel it cost them, simply to avoid setting foot in a forge that housed an orc. Tomas watched his income thin through that autumn and into winter, watched the coin jar on his mantle grow lighter, and said nothing to Soraya about any of it, not wanting her to carry the weight of a sacrifice she hadn't asked him to make. But slowly, the way iron softens under sustained heat long before it ever bends to the hammer, something in her began, almost imperceptibly, to change. She started watching him work. Not the wary, defensive watching of the early days, but something closer to study, the focused attention of someone trying to understand a thing rather than merely survive it. She'd sit near the forge, knees drawn to her chest, and track the rhythm of his hammer strikes, the way he read the color of heated iron to know when it was ready to shape, the particular angle he held the tongs to keep his fingers safe from the heat. One evening in early winter, without being asked, without a word exchanged between them, she rose from her corner, crossed the room, and took up the bellows. She began to pump them in steady rhythm, and it was the right rhythm, matched precisely to his hammer strikes, as if she'd absorbed the pattern simply through weeks of watching closely enough that her hands already knew it before she'd consciously decided to try. Tomas stopped mid-strike, startled, and looked at her. She froze instantly, bellows still in her hands, and looked away fast, shoulders hunching, the posture of someone bracing for a blow, expecting that presuming to help, to act without permission, would earn punishment the way it apparently always had before. Good. Tomas said instead, keeping his voice level, unremarkable. Keep that rhythm. A little slower on the upstroke. You want the air pushing steady, not in gasps. She glanced back at him, searching his face again for the trap she still half expected. Finding none, something shifted in her expression. Something that wasn't quite a smile, not yet, but was no longer only fear either. She kept pumping the bellows. He went back to his hammer. Neither of them spoke another word that evening, but something had changed in the silence between them, made it lighter than it had been. By midwinter, she was speaking, first in fragments, single words offered cautiously like coins she wasn't certain she could spare, then gradually in full sentences, her common tongue thick with an accent that belonged to mountain passes far from Ashford Hollow's gentle, cultivated valley. She told him her story in pieces, over many long nights by the forge fire, never all at once, as if the telling itself cost her something she could only afford in small installments. The patrol that found her hadn't found a war camp, as the village still believed, still whispered about at the well and in the tavern. They'd found a refugee camp, the broken remnant of a clan fleeing a worse war on the far side of the northern mountains, where two orc warlords had been tearing each other's territories apart for 3 years, burning crops and salting wells, and conscripting anyone old enough to hold a blade. Soraya's clan had wanted no part of either warlord's war. They'd tried to flee south, toward the human lands, hoping distance and a border might offer the safety neither warlord would. It hadn't worked. A scouting party from one of the warlords had found their camp in the night. Soraya's mother, a healer, not a warrior, Soraya told him, her voice going very quiet and very careful when she spoke of her, had died holding the camp's southern flank long enough for the children to scatter into the treeline. Soraya didn't know, even now, whether her mother's death had bought enough time for anyone else to escape. "My brother," she said one night, staring into the forge fire rather than at him, her voice barely above the crackle of the coals. "Hell, younger than me. 8 winters. We ran together, into the trees. Got separated in the dark, I don't know how. One moment his hand was in mine, the next." She trailed off, swallowed hard, tusks catching the firelight. "I looked for 3 days. Found nothing. No body. No sign. I don't know if he's dead, or if someone else found him first." Tomas didn't offer false comfort. He'd learned, in his own years of grief, how hollow false comfort sounded to someone genuinely drowning in loss. He simply said, "We'll ask." Quietly. "Traders come through here from the north sometimes. Refugee columns too, when the passes are clear enough. I'll ask what I can, without drawing trouble to you." She looked at him then, really looked, her one good eye. The other had healed by now, though a faint scar remained along the lid, searching his face with something that had stopped being suspicion and had become, instead, a kind of fragile, frightened hope. "Why?" she asked. "Why any of this? The cage. The blood price. Now this. You don't know me. You don't owe me anything." Tomas was quiet a long moment, turning the question over the way he'd turn a piece of raw iron, looking for where to strike first. "I had a daughter," he finally said. "Ren. She died young. Fever, same winter as her mother. The house has been very quiet since. Quieter than a house should be." He paused. "I'm not telling you that to make you feel you owe me something for it. I'm telling you because I think you deserve the truth instead of a prettier reason. I didn't free you because I'm a good man, Soraya. I freed you because I looked at that cage and I couldn't stand the thought of one more thing in this world being made to suffer when somebody could have stopped it and chose not to. That's not virtue. That's just refusing to be the kind of man who looks away." Soraya said nothing for a long while. Then, very quietly, she reached out and added another log to the forge fire. An unnecessary gesture. The fire was burning fine, but a gesture nonetheless, of staying, of choosing to remain a while longer in the warmth of the conversation rather than retreating to her corner. It was, Tomas understood without her saying so, the closest thing to trust she had to offer yet. Spring came, and with it, change that even Ashford Hollow's stubborn suspicion couldn't entirely hold back. Soraya had been lifting the hammer herself for weeks now. Small pieces at first, simple nails and hooks, while Tomas corrected her grip and her angle and the timing of her strikes. But orc strength, even in a 15-year-old girl still growing into her full size, was a genuine and considerable gift at the anvil. By the time the spring planting season arrived, she was forging plowshares and harness fittings with a precision that came from someone who had spent her whole short, hard life learning to pay very close attention to everything around her, because inattention had always cost her something. The villagers who came to the forge, fewer than before, but not none, since some needs couldn't wait for a 4-day round trip to the next town, found, often to their visible discomfort, that her work was good. Better than good, in some cases. A latch she mended held tighter than the original. A hinge she forged swung smoother than anything Tomas himself had made in years. It was Barin, of all people, who broke first, not from any change of heart, but from simple, grudging practicality. His plow snapped clean through its iron collar in the middle of spring planting, with no time to spare for the journey to another smith and back. He came to Tomas's forge with his jaw set like a man swallowing something bitter and asked, without quite meeting anyone's eyes, for the repair. Tomas could have done it himself. Instead, he nodded toward Soraya, who was already moving toward the cold plow collar, tools in hand. Birin watched her work in tight, uncomfortable silence, watched her measure the break, heat the metal with the precise control of someone who understood exactly how iron behaved under different temperatures, watched her hammer strikes land clean and sure, none of the hesitation or wasted motion of an apprentice still finding her rhythm. When she handed the mended collar back to him, fitted and cooled and stronger at the weld than the original casting had been, Barin turned it over in his hands for a long moment, searching, Tomas suspected, for some flaw to comment on, some justification for the contempt he'd been nursing for the better part of a year. He didn't find one. "My thanks," he muttered finally, the words clearly costing him something. He paid Tomas the agreed coin, turned, and left quickly, as if lingering any longer might require him to say something further, something he wasn't yet ready to say. It wasn't redemption. Not for Barin, not for the village as a whole. Old fear doesn't dissolve because of one mended plow collar. But it was a beginning, the kind of beginning made not from grand gestures, but from small, repeated, undeniable acts. The way a blade isn't made from a single strike, but from 1,000 small corrections, hammer and fire and patience, until something strong enough to hold its edge finally takes shape. The trader came through Ashford Hollow in early summer, a wiry, weathered woman named Isa who ran a small cart of goods between the border villages and the northern passes, trading in news as much as in goods, the way traders in border country often did. Tomas had asked, quietly, every trader who'd passed through since winter, careful never to draw attention to why he was asking, never mentioning Soraya by name in the village square where ears might carry the question further than he intended. Isa was the first to bring back something more than a shrug and a shake of the head. "Or child, you said." "Boy, 8 winters, name of Pell." Isa asked, accepting the mug of small beer Tomas offered in the forge's back room, well away from the square's prying eyes. "There's a settlement 2 valleys north of the old contested line, survivors of the warlord conflicts, mixed clans, banded together for safety more than kinship. Heard talk there of a boy matching that description, taken in by the settlement maybe 8 months back. Half-starved, wouldn't speak for weeks. Settlement healer there gave him a name since he wouldn't offer his own, but the timing fits, and so does the description, far as second-hand talk can confirm anything." Tomas's chest went tight. He didn't dare hope too hard, too fast. He'd learned that lesson from his own grief, the cruelty of hope that turned out hollow. But he carried the news back to Soraya that evening with as much careful honesty as he could manage, laying out exactly what was known and unknown, refusing to dress it up as more certain than it was. Soraya was silent for a long time after he finished. Then, very quietly, "I have to go and see." "I know," Tomas said. "I'll come with you, if you'll have me. The road north isn't safe for a girl traveling alone, orc or otherwise, and not safer, frankly, for what people might assume about a lone orc traveling armed, given the trouble in that region. 2 of us, with a blacksmith's papers and trade goods as cover, draws less suspicion." She looked at him for a long moment, the same searching look she'd given him outside the cage, all those months ago, checking for the lie. She didn't find one then, either. "Thank you," she said, and it was the first time she'd said the words to him plainly, without flinching, without the wariness that had colored almost everything between them until now. The journey took 11 days, following trade roads that grew rougher and less traveled the further north they went, until the gentle hills of Ashford Hollow's valley gave way to the harder, stonier slopes that marked the beginning of contested country. Tomas closed the forge for the duration, a financial risk he genuinely couldn't afford, not after a winter of thin business. But some debts, he decided, mattered more than coin. Soraya was different on the road. More watchful, in a way that had nothing to do with fear of Tomas and everything to do with old instincts surfacing. Instincts honed by months of fleeing, hiding, surviving in country where the wrong noise or the wrong silhouette against the treeline could mean death. She moved through the forest stretches of the journey with an ease that made clear, more than anything she'd said, just how much of her short life had been spent exactly this way. Alert, careful, ready. They reached the mixed-clan settlement on the 11th evening, a cluster of timber longhouses and canvas shelters tucked into a sheltered valley, smoke rising from cook fires, the sounds of children's voices carrying on the evening air. Human and orc children both, Tomas noted, playing some chasing game together in the open ground between the shelters, unbothered by any divide the wider world insisted mattered so much. Soraya stopped walking the moment she heard it. Stood very still, scanning the children's faces from a distance, searching. And then, a small figure among them froze too, mid-stride, staring across the clearing. Tomas would remember, for the rest of his life, the sound Soraya made then. Not quite a word, not quite a sob, something that broke loose from somewhere she'd kept very tightly sealed for the better part of a year. She was running before Tomas had fully registered she'd moved, and the boy, smaller than Tomas had pictured, thinner than a child his age should be, but unmistakably, achingly alive, was running too, and they collided in the middle of the clearing with the force of two people who had each spent months believing the other might be dead. Tomas stood at the edge of the clearing and let them have the moment, his own throat tight in a way he hadn't expected, watching Soraya hold her brother like she was afraid letting go would make him vanish again. Pell did not want to leave the settlement at first. He'd found something like safety there, a healer who'd been kind to him, other children who didn't flinch from his tusks or his strength. It took 2 more days of careful conversation, of Soraya explaining, gently, what waited in Ashford Hollow. Not a perfect place, not yet a place that had fully accepted her, but a place with a forge, with steady food, with a man who'd paid his own blood to make a promise of safety, and had kept that promise every day since. He sounds like the healer here, Pell finally said, studying Tomas with the same flat, assessing look Soraya herself had once given him outside the cage. The kind who doesn't ask anything back for the kindness. That's exactly the kind, Soraya said, and for the first time since Tomas had known her, she smiled. A full, unguarded thing that changed her whole face. They left the settlement 3 days later, the 3 of them now, and the road back to Ashford Hollow felt shorter than the road north had been, the way roads often do when you're traveling towards something instead of merely searching. Ashford Hollow did not transform overnight upon their return. Some things never fully would. Henrik still muttered about beastkin under his breath, and a handful of families still crossed the square rather than pass too near the forge. Old fear, once it's taken root, rarely dies all at once. But something had shifted, slowly and irreversibly. The way iron once properly tempered doesn't return to its raw, brittle state. Soraya's work at the anvil had earned a grudging, practical respect that gossip couldn't fully erase. Pell, small and quick and eager to please in the particular way of children who've learned that being useful is the surest path to being kept, found his own place running errands and minding the forge's smaller tasks, and the village's children, who hold grudges far less stubbornly than their parents, gradually folded him into their games, the way children often do when adults aren't actively teaching them otherwise. 2 years passed this way. The forge prospered again, slowly, as old customers drifted back, won over by quality of work they couldn't easily find elsewhere, and as new customers came specifically because word had spread, even beyond Ashford Hollow, of the unusually skilled smith girl with the steady hammer and the careful eye. It was in the 3rd spring after the cage that the raiders came down from the northern pass. Not refugees fleeing war, this time, but a warband itself, splintered off from one of the dying warlord factions, hungry and desperate, and pushing south into human territory in search of plunder. The watchhorn sounded at dawn. Ashford Hollow's militia was small, mostly farmers with spears they hadn't drilled with seriously in years, facing down a warband of orcs who'd done nothing but fight for the past 3 years of their lives. Soraya was at the southern wall before the horn had finished sounding, hammer in hand. Not a weapon she'd been trained to fight with, but the only one she had, and in her hands, swung with the same precision she brought to every strike at the anvil. It proved devastating enough. Tomas fought beside her, old soldier's instincts surfacing after years of dormancy, and Pell, too young to fight, ran messages between the wall and the village center, directing the wounded toward the healer's house with a steadiness that belied his years. The fighting was brief but vicious. Ashford Hollow's militia, reinforced by 2 villagers who'd once been soldiers and 1 orc smith girl who fought like the war had been bred into her marrow despite everything she'd tried to become instead, held the southern wall until the magistrate's regional guard arrived, summoned by the watchhorn's signal fires, scattering the remaining raiders back toward the pass. When it was over, Barin, bleeding from a shallow cut along his forearm, having picked up a spear himself rather than hide, found Soraya at the well, washing the blood from her hands, her shoulders shaking with the particular exhaustion that follows violence, even violence undertaken in defense of people who hadn't always deserved defending. "You didn't have to fight for us," Barin said, his voice rough. "After everything. The stones. The things I said." Soraya looked up at him, her good eye, both eyes now, the scar along the old lid the only remaining mark of that first injury, steady and clear. "I didn't fight for you," she said. "I fought for him." She nodded toward where Tomas was helping carry the wounded toward the healer's house. "And for Pell. And because somewhere along the way, this stopped being a place I was trapped in and started being a place I was from. You don't have to deserve someone's loyalty to receive it, Barin. You just have to be standing next to the people they love when it matters." Barin had no answer for that. He simply nodded, once, and turned to help with the wounded himself. Years later, when Pell had grown tall enough to work the bellows himself and Soraya had taken on her own apprentices, 2 human children from families who'd once thrown stones, now sending their sons to learn the trade from the smith everyone in 3 villages agreed was among the finest in the region, Tomas would sometimes sit by the forge fire in the evenings and think back to a rusted cage in the village square, and a girl with one swollen eye who'd watched him with flat, exhausted wariness, waiting to learn what kind of cruelty he represented. He never told her, not directly, what that first act of kindness had cost him. The customers lost, the years of suspicion endured, the blood paid at the village stone. He didn't need to. She'd lived alongside the cost of it for years, had watched him absorb the village's anger so that none of it would land on her, had come to understand, slowly, that some kindness is only real when it's expensive. "Why did you do it?" she asked him once more, years after the first time she'd asked, sitting across the forge fire from him on a quiet winter evening. Pell long since asleep in the loft above, her own apprentices gone home for the night. Tomas considered the question with the same care he'd give a piece of unworked iron, turning it over, looking for the honest answer rather than the comfortable one. "Because somebody has to decide that kindness is worth more than safety," he finally said. "Somebody has to go first, without knowing if it'll be paid back. If everyone waits for proof before they're willing to risk something, nobody ever risks anything, and the world just keeps being exactly as cruel as it's always been." Soraya was quiet a long moment, watching the fire. "You didn't know what was in me," she said, "when you knelt outside that cage. You didn't know if I'd burn this whole village down the first chance I got." "No," Tomas agreed. "I didn't know. I just knew what was in the village already. If I did nothing, children throwing stones at a starving child, a magistrate planning to sell tickets to a hanging. I'd already seen exactly what cruelty without consequence looks like. I decided to find out what the alternative looked like instead." She looked at him, something warm and steady in her gaze that had taken years to grow there, the way trust always does when it's built honestly instead of demanded. "It looked like this," she said quietly, gesturing. "At the forge, at the sleeping loft above where her brother dreamed safely, at the 2 of them sitting together in firelight that asked nothing of either of them except to keep burning. It looked like home." Tomas Greer, who had once been a soldier, and then a grieving father, and then simply a man who couldn't stand to watch one more cruelty pass unchallenged, allowed himself, for the first time in many years, to feel something that wasn't quite happiness but stood very close beside it. He'd paid in blood to free a caged girl and make her his ward. In the years since, she'd paid him back 1,000 times over, not in coin, which he'd never wanted, but in exactly the thing he hadn't realized, until she gave it to him, that he'd been missing most. She'd made his silent house loud again. She'd made it, after so many years of empty rooms, a home.